Okay, so hello everyone, and thank you for coming tonight. I would love first, of course, to welcome Admiral Blair, who will be sharing with us some of his time and expertise this evening. And I would like to emphasize what an honor it is for us, for all of us, to have you here tonight. So thank you so much, Admiral. Thank you so much. I will try to be very, very brief in my introduction, and then just let Admiral Blair speak. But this is not an easy task, because Admiral Blair has had an incredible career. He was born in the state of Maine, and he graduated from the United States Naval Academy, to then went on to study at Oxford under the Rhodes Scholarship, and to serve for over 34 years in the Navy as officer and admiral, his last job in the military being that of Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Command, and this is not a small feat, I can assure you. After his retirement from the Navy, he served as the third director of national intelligence under President Obama in 2009 and 2010, and is currently on the board of directors of various organizations such as Freedom House. And this is all very amazing, but much more important than this, he was also my professor, a distinguished professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and he was a rather unique professor at that, because with him we had the pleasure and the responsibility of, for the first time in my life at least, working very seriously on history and strategy. Professor Blair is an Asia expert, and his course on American strategy in the Asia Pacific is as rich and comprehensive as undergraduate courses can get. So if some of his wisdom manages to reach us here tonight, we will be more than satisfied. So let's start by asking you some questions, Admiral Blair. Could you please tell us about your career? What exactly is the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Command? And what does the Director of National Intelligence do? Thank you so much.
Well, Pedro, I'll certainly get on with those questions, but first let me thank you for inviting me to participate in this event. I have to tell your fellow students that Pedro gave me a very positive view of Spanish students. If all of you are like Pedro, then Spain has a bright future. So it was a pleasure to have him in the class, and I'm happy to be able to maintain contact like this. And I also apologize for missing our original date of last week. When I was Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Command, my staff had about 1,000 people. Many of them had the job of just keeping me on time and on schedule, and I no longer have that staff, so I have a more difficult time of getting my calendar correct. But here we are, and this is good. My career started in the late 1960s when I graduated from the Naval Academy. That was a very tumultuous time in the United States. The Vietnam War was going on, but also many other disrupting events. Drugs were coming in. My generation was thought that their parents were idiots. They didn't understand what should be done, the freedoms that should be available to young people, the foreign policy that we should be pursuing. There were student riots. There were the civil rights movement was also raging, and there were burnings in American cities, and so it was a very, as I say, disorganized and unruly time. I joined the Navy because it was sort of the family business. In fact, I'm a sixth generation Navy officer. My son was seventh generation, and it was sort of what we did. So I went ahead in the Navy, and it was a very difficult time. We withdrew from Vietnam, which was the correct decision, but it was a very it was a decision which made it hard on the U.S. Armed Forces. Funding went down. We were not respected much by our fellow citizens. But during that time, the armed forces, the leadership of the armed forces really went through a self-examination of how had we done, why had we done so badly in Vietnam? What should we do to improve the armed forces? And did a lot of important intellectual work at that time. So by the time President Reagan was elected in 1980 and began to restore the funding within the U.S. Armed Forces, the leadership had done the thinking to be able to use that money wisely and to very much improve our performance and our equipment. And from that time on, the armed forces became a really good place to work. My career happened. It was not by planning, but just sort of happened to be spent almost entirely in the Pacific when I was on ships, and then in Washington when I had shore jobs, staff jobs, or in Hawaii where I had other staff jobs. I mainly concentrated on the Asia Pacific area, and then I was fortunate enough to be chosen, as Pedro said, to be the combatant commander for the Asia Pacific region. The United States is really the only country that has the hubris to divide the world up into 7 areas and put a 4-star admiral or general in charge of each one. Spain happens to fall, for example, in the area of responsibility of the U.S. European commander, who is also the NATO supreme commander. But I think we're the only country that divides the world up like that. But I was basically the senior military commander for the part of the world that stretched from the eastern coast of Africa, across the Indian Ocean, across Asia, across to the west coast of the United States. And my job was to command all of the forces that were in that area, to worry about the threats that might affect the United States, to take advantage of opportunities, to try to improve our relations and our coordination with as many countries as we could, both our traditional allies like Japan, Republic of Korea, Australia, Philippines, Thailand, but also with countries that were not allies but were important to have good relations with, like India, Indonesia, countries such as that. In the early part of my 3 years there as that combatant commander, there was not a big threat to American interests. We had won the Cold. Well, I think it's not really accurate to say that the West had won the Cold War. It's more that the Soviet Union lost it. Their internal contributions finally caused the collapse of their economy, and we know the history of the dissolution, first of the Warsaw Pact, then of the Soviet Union itself, and then the difficulties that Russia itself had. So our traditional Cold War ally was no longer a threat. China was beginning to make its weight felt, but we still felt there was a possibility that China could develop as a country that would become more powerful, but would operate really within the framework of the liberal democratic order that the United States and its friends and allies had developed. And so, although there were concerns about China, they were not. They were concerns that were tempered with a lot of optimism as well. And so, the job during that time was to try to build international institutions, international cooperation, build the idea that there were common challenges that all countries had, everything from climate change through countering drugs, through cooperation on countries like North Korea, which were clearly dangerous to all of us. And that was sort of the attitude for the first few years. And I think we made some progress in cooperating with countries on that basis. And then the 9/11 attacks happened in 2001. Those attacks were, of course, centered in the Al-Qaeda. They were conducted by the Al-Qaeda group under Osama bin Laden. They were planned, and the headquarters of Al-Qaeda was in Afghanistan. Those who conducted the attack were primarily Egyptians and Saudis and a few others. So it was mostly a Middle East-centered threat. But in the Pacific, there were affiliates of Al-Qaeda. It turned out that about 5,000 or 6,000 Muslims from countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore had gone to Pakistan during the first Afghan war against the Soviet Union, had joined the fight there, and had come back to their countries in Southeast Asia, which is where most Muslims actually live, not in the Middle East, had come back to their countries carrying these radical anti-Western ideas, which dominated Al-Qaeda thinking, and they had formed cells, and they were planning attacks on Americans and on the United States, and so we had to deal with that. And in particular, I remember in December of 2001, 3 months after the attack, there was quite a well-developed plot in Singapore to use bombs on bicycles. You know, many bicycles in Asian cities have those trunks in the back of them that are about half a meter by 1 meter. The idea was for this terrorist group to pack those with explosives, put them at subway entrances where American sailors of visiting ships would come out and detonate them and kill American sailors and a lot of innocent Singaporean civilians. So there were terrorist threats in our region as well. And so the last half of my time as the Pacific commander, a lot of our effort was directed towards understanding and then dealing with any of the Islamist terrorist groups that were in that part of the world. And in the meantime, the ambitions of China were becoming more and more apparent. It was becoming harder to believe that China was simply going to accept the rules of the or the customs of the dominant American-dominated order, either in the economy, in finance, or in the military balances. So we spent time building up our capability to use military force in the Western Pacific around Taiwan, in particular, if China should continue its aggressive path. And as we know, in the years since, China has become much more aggressive in terms of asserting its rights and wanting to change the order that it found when it became a great power. So those were really the issues that we worked on. We did some positive things when East Timor, on the East Timor issue, when Indonesia allowed a referendum in East Timor, I think it was in 1999 as the year, and the East Timorese overwhelmingly voted to become an independent country, and in Indonesia, or at least a faction within the Indonesian armed forces, decided to overturn the results of that referendum and basically keep it as a military garrison. We were very active, along with diplomacy led by Australia, to put the pressure on Indonesia to accept the results of the referendum. And then many countries in Asia, including the United States, sent a UN-led peacekeeping force to not only keep order within East Timor, but to prevent the Indonesians from bringing in troops to subjugate East Timor once again. And I think most of us were pretty proud of that operation. It provided a country that deserved to be separate from Indonesia with that independence. And Timor-Leste today is certainly not Switzerland, but it's a country that is much better than it was under Indonesian influence. In the war on terror, there was a pocket of a local terrorist group in the southern Philippines, down near the big island of Mindanao. It was really a combination terrorist and criminal organization, which would take hostages for ransom, which would attack businesses and steal from banks at the same time that it was making terrorist plots. The Indonesian or the Philippine security forces were not having a lot of success in suppressing it. There were some pretty misguided Philippine policies which were making economic and social conditions worse in that part of the Philippines. The Philippines are dominated by the Luzon-based Catholic heritage power elites. Mindanao in the south is Muslim, relatively poor and agricultural, not receiving much attention from Manila. So the United States not only put a task force into southern Philippines to try to improve the skills of the Philippine security services, but also put pressure on the Philippines to improve the economic condition in that part of their country, to provide less of a breeding ground for terrorist groups to attract support. And that operation also was fairly successful. I left that job as Pacific Commander in February of 2002. Was somewhat horrified to find that we invaded Iraq, or less than a year later. It's a complicated story, but from a professional military point of view, the most egregious part of that was not planning for how the country would be handled once the Saddam Hussein regime was knocked off. And I would say that the Saddam Hussein and his regime richly deserved to be removed from power. He was a murderous thug who killed many Iraqis, used chemical weapons against Iranians, and he was definitely a despot who deserved to be removed. But you can't just go in and knock out a bad ruler, however deserving he is of being removed, unless you have a realistic and well-resourced plan as to what you're going to do after the victory. And the United States simply did not. The leadership at that time thought that somehow it could go in, remove Saddam Hussein, withdraw, and the country would somehow heal itself and get back on its feet, because it had oil reserves and because it had a diaspora of Iraqis who had left the country, who were capable of administering it should they return. That turned out simply not to be true, and you all know the history of that unfortunate country, which continues to this day. So that sort of happened after I left. I worked in. I ran a government think tank for a while after that, and then was quite surprised to be invited to come back as Director of National Intelligence with the Obama administration in 2009. The position of the Director of National Intelligence had grown out of the attacks, the September 11th attacks, in which it was pretty clear that the intelligence community needed to be pulled together in order to better share intelligence, to better integrate its activities, that these were a bunch of agencies that, however good they were individually, did not have a culture of sharing, of working together, and we paid that price on 9/11. Unfortunately, it was an incomplete piece of legislation that really did not give the Director of National Intelligence full authority over all of the 17 national intelligence agencies that are in the U.S. Government. In particular, the intelligence agencies that work for the Department of Defense and the Central Intelligence Agency, which had been an independent agency reporting directly to the president ever since it had been founded. Both of these organizations resented having a new boss between them and the White House, and they were, as they told me, they were like a bunch of happy children who had been put into an orphanage, and I was the head of the orphanage, and so it was a struggle. It was a struggle. The White House, President Obama and his staff, were themselves ambivalent about the job of Director of National Intelligence. They did not provide full support for a empowered Director of National Intelligence. They wanted to be able to talk directly with intelligence agencies themselves, particularly the CIA. And so from a bureaucratic point of view, it was a frustrating year and a half that I spent in that job, which ultimately resulted in me leaving when the tensions between my authority and the independence that the CIA wanted really came to a head. Nonetheless, during that time, we made some solid progress, I think, on bringing the activities of the intelligence agencies together. Mechanical things like ensuring that intelligence could be shared across the community. Things like focusing combined intelligence resources on particular problems, whether they be North Korea or Iraq or China or Russia. So behind the scenes, we made some solid progress in bringing the community together, despite the conflicts of prerogatives and authority between the specific agencies and the Director of National Intelligence. At that time, the primary intelligence support that was really important was supporting the operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. By that time, we had two major deployed forces that were operating, and I do have to say that the cooperation of the intelligence agencies in the field in Afghanistan and in Iraq were much better than it had been in the past, and a lot of that was due to the Director of National Intelligence organization. The activity that I'd say was most controversial at that time were the drone attacks that were being conducted by both the CIA and the Special Operations Command. At that time, drone attacks on terrorist leaders had a seductive quality because they gave the impression that we were making progress against terrorists as we would manage to kill or capture or damage one organization after another. But none of us who were involved in that felt that we could win the war against terrorist groups simply by knocking off leaders. There was always somebody to move up to take the place of the leader that had been removed. The underlying conditions were not changed, but nonetheless, this gave the impression of progress. I think probably the highlight of that, which happened after I left the job, was when the Special Operations Command captured Osama bin Laden, and that was a very skillful combined use of intelligence and military resources to make that raid as successful as it was, and that I would say unfortunately gave the illusion of progress and removed some of the pressure for the continuing integration and improvement of coordination that needed to be done. Ironically, in the area of countering terrorism, little reform was actually needed because the shock of 9/11 meant that everybody in the intelligence community was going to work hard on that issue, was going to share intelligence, was going to work with others. It was widely recognized that the lack of cooperation had led to the successful attack. But my focus was to try to extend that same urgency, that same desire to share, to work together, to the other important intelligence problems which the United States faced, whether they were from countries that were opposed to the United States and our allies, or whether they were independent movements. And I made some progress on doing that, I feel, but there's still a lot to be done. So let me stop there, Pedro, with
Yeah, these are very interesting questions. We can talk about this like for hours. So we have over 30 people here, and we would like to make some room for some time for the questions. So I think we're going to open the floor now for your questions. So maybe we can start on the table.
Yeah. First of all, we are hugely honored to have you here. Thank you so much once again. What I was thinking about is, don't you think that the use of the term war on terror could lead to catastrophic views about the phenomena of terrorism? And apart from that, I also had the question about your own opinion about the limits of the collateral damages regarding the drone attacks you had to tackle. So thank you so much.
No, those are both good questions. Yes, you're right. The term of that very broad term, war on terror, expanded the scope and ambitions of the project, of the whole campaign, much more widely than it should have been. For the first couple of years, we really did not know the capacity, the capability of Al-Qaeda and other groups that worked with it. There were 5 teams that made the 9/11 attack. Were there 50 teams that had been trained, and were they ready to make waves of attacks? So in the early years, I think the very strong reaction of the United States is understandable. And that also explains a lot of the other controversial actions that the country took at that time, the black sites, in which prisoners were subjected to strong measures to try to get information from them, the establishment of the Guantanamo Bay prison, the general emphasis on security that turned many of our local police agencies into much more militarized organization. All of that sort of grew out of that uncertainty of the first couple of years. Where we made a mistake, I think, was not realizing that Al-Qaeda had really taken its best shot at 9/11, that it really did not have much capability after that. It had ambitions, but it really didn't have the capacity following that. It turned out that using airplanes for an attack was a uniquely damaging, attention-getting kind of attack. I mean, it was horrific. But once the United States and other countries tightened the restrictions on airline travel, that really virtually eliminated that threat. And as we have seen in the years since, Al-Qaeda and other groups that wanted to use terrorist tactics had to resorted to much less damaging approaches. Trucks that would be rammed into crowds, the attacks in Spain on the rail system, which were relatively small explosives in a fairly large number of places, but the damage was not on the scale of thousands of dead as it was with the 9/11 attacks. So I think the continuation of the term war on terror and its continuation as sort of the central foreign policy focus of the United States for that many years was in fact a mistake. We should have put it in a tighter perspective, and we should have put it in the context of the other threats to the United States and to our friends and allies. And we didn't do this politically convenient. It was potentially dangerous not to if we were wrong. There are a lot of factors that made that war on terror continue, and in retrospect, that was a mistake. So on the collateral damage on the drone attacks, there are two extremes that have been publicly discussed. John Brennan, the National Security Advisor, at one point said there were 0 casualties from the drone attacks, which was an underestimate. Some of the public groups tracked thousands of them. My observation by looking at the data was that the number of casualties was relatively small compared to other kinds of attacks, and that the United States took very strong precautions to keep it as small as it could. And so it was, I think it was controlled about as well as it could be. As I said, I think of greater importance was the underlying idea that continued levels of drone attacks could actually destroy these groups. I think we should have reduced the number of attacks, which in turn would have reduced the number of civilian casualties. Once we had once we had removed the most capable leaders of the terrorist groups, we should have used them more selectively. So that's sort of my assessment of that. As we look at, for instance, the attacks in Gaza being made by Israeli conventionally delivered but precision weapons, they clearly are on a scale much greater than the smaller drone attacks that the United States used against terrorist groups. I don't know what the actual numbers are coming out of the Gaza. Right now, the newspapers are reporting the numbers that that Hamas itself gives to them. I would treat those with a grain of salt, but they aren't zero. You know, they aren't. These are not perfect attacks, and it's awfully hard under those conditions to say one less or one more is good. Let me make one other point about about terrorist tactics and their effect. The only exception, the only weapon that could turn a terrorist group into a really major threat to all of our countries would be if it could get hold of chemical, biological, or nuclear materials. These materials can cause damage in the tens of thousands or millions in terms of deaths and major illnesses. Fortunately, it turns out that it's harder to use or to acquire and to use these kinds of weapons than your popular fiction would let you think. But nonetheless, if a terrorist group were able to get hold of some of these weapons of mass destruction, they have every incentive to use them, and they cannot be deterred from using them as our countries, which have something to lose. This awful logic of deterrence is if I have weapons of mass destruction and you have them, I won't use them because you'll attack me back. That doesn't apply in the case of terrorist groups who have no country, no base, no homeland that could be used. So I think the biggest concern that all of us had in dealing with terrorist groups was the threat of one of them getting hold of the materials needed for a chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons attack, and the expertise actually to be able to pull it off. And that's a threat to this day against all of our countries.
Thank you so much. Let's see if we have any questions from the public. Yeah, we do. Let's see if you can hear the speaker.
Not yet.
Sorry.
Wait a sec.
Good night. Can you hear me? No.
I think so.
Maybe you can speak a little bit louder.
Yeah. Can you hear me now? Okay. Thank you so much. Good night. Well, I wanted to ask you, maybe it's a broad question, but it's just about the Indo-Pacific situation, of course, in respect to China. That may be the main point right now. And my main question is your own opinion about the strategy that the US is following with the Indo-Pacific allies in respect to China. Do you think that it should be like a more aggressive policy, most based on military bases, geopolitical aspects, territory, allies with countries, or should the US focus more on being competitive economically with China, or is this economic competition with China not possible anymore? Thank you.
No, that's a tremendous question, and a lot of trees and electron have died on discussing that question in recent years, of course, by experts and politicians. So I think the competition between China on the one hand and and the United States and our friends and allies and like-minded countries, on the other hand, is at heart an economic competition. Which approach will, in the end, provide prosperity to its people, will develop the technologies and the resources to have economic and financial power at a greater rate. I think whichever coalition, and it's a coalition on the side ranged against China, and it's sort of China plus a bunch of pygmies on the other side, that competition will determine how the world develops in the future, and whether it'll be the kind of world we live in now, or whether it will be a quite different world. And it's a complicated competition, but at heart, it has to do with the degree to which markets and the private sector of our economies play a strong role versus a government-directed set of economic policies plays a role. Both countries are actually mixtures, aren't they, of a public sector and a private sector. But I think that over the long term, the greater role that advanced countries in North America, Europe, and Asia give to private sector and profits in the market will be ultimately superior. And it's primarily, I think, because of the difficulty of predicting the technology of the future. Right now, the sector which makes the most, will make the most difference is still ICT, information and communications technology. The revolution in ICT that began back in the 90s is still very strong. I mean, the latest developments in artificial intelligence and machine learning are just one more wave of the manipulation of information, the speed of transmission, the power of computers. And yet, if you look at the history of it, nobody has been able to predict actually precisely what form this will take. Excuse me a sec. Hey, Don, I'm on a Zoom call. I'll be, we've got about 20 minutes. Okay. It's hard to predict how this thing will turn out. I watched a movie recently. There was a story of BlackBerry. Everybody remember BlackBerries? Yeah. Those little buttons, and they were dominant. They had 40% of the world's smartphone market in 2008, and now they're zero. And the record of being able to predict exactly which technology will be dominant, which form of 5G will be the one that we all fall in, what new gadget will be developed. I mean, I think the only way to be to win that competition is to be very flexible and to let the market and competition under some regulation fight it out and then go forward, rather than some group of government bureaucrats deciding that this will be the standard for this device or this communications protocol or the other. So I think in the ICT dominated world of the future economy, the looser, more market-driven regimes have an inherent advantage. and the Chinese approach of doubling down on to try to gain first mover advantage, to try to define the way things will go, and then pile in with government subsidies on those will ultimately lose. Now, there are some counterexamples, right? Long ago, for a variety of reasons, China decided that it wanted to dominate the electric vehicle market. Right now, at least in the United States, and I suspect in Spain, the market has not gone entirely that direction. There are many reasons that people still buy gasoline vehicles, cars and trucks, and it will take a while for the market to decide. China has gone all in on electric vehicles. They have subsidized companies like BYD, which now has become it's surpassed Toyota in the number of cars that it exports. So sometimes you'll be right in guessing on which technology will be dominant and subsidizing it and trying to gain first mover advantage in that. But I think most of the time in the ICT region, you will be wrong. So I think in the underlying area of economic competition, we should not try to compete with China on ideology, on government directed and subsidized economic development programs, but we should allow quite a bit of the market churn. On the military side, I think what's lost in the general debate about war between China and other countries is that the military issues in the Western Pacific are quite specific. This is not like the Cold War, when there was an entire 2,000 kilometer border between Eastern Europe and Western Europe, and the military objectives were at issue were a Soviet takeover of all of Western Europe. I don't know, maybe the Pyrenees would have stopped that, and you all would have been okay. But it was certainly, the Soviet planning was all the way through France to the Channel should conventional war break out. So in China, the case of China, the Chinese claims are very specific. Taiwan is the biggest one that dominates everything. The Senkaku Islands, disputed between Japan and China. Further south, China's claims to the South China Sea, disputed with 5 other countries. So the military flashpoints in that part of the world are very specific, and I, for one, have a hard time thinking that those military flashpoints would ignite even if war did break out over them, would ignite a world war on the scale that we feared during the Cold War between the Warsaw Pact and NATO on the other hand. So I think that the military aspect is very specific, which is the United States and its allies having enough capability to deter Taiwan from military moves against specific targets. So if that can be done, and military conflict can be contained, then I think it's basically an economic competition. Ideologically, I don't think there's a real competition. I mean, the Chinese talk about soft power, and they spread Confucius institutions around the world. I don't know if you have one at your university, but they're closing like failed Best Buy franchises in the United States. They're going away, and China doesn't have any ideological appeal compared to what Western countries have. So it's basically military deterrence on specific issues, and then economic competition. Now, as you all know, in politics, taking a taking a realistic, restrained view towards competition is not a real vote getter. What you tend to do is give stirring speeches about the Chinese threat has to be opposed across the board. No Chinese can be trusted. This will all turn out terribly. We need to spend a whole lot of money on these things, and that's sort of the nature of a political response. And that can be bad. That can get you carried away into doing stupid things. But I think that people who think about it carefully and are actually making the major decisions in the United States right now are trying to build up forces to deter specific Chinese military adventures, and then to work on the economic competition. I would say the best ally that we have in the West is Xi Jinping. I just think it's wonderful that he has declared himself a dictator for life. I have some personal experience now on how older people think rather than younger people, and older people get fixed in their ideas. They try the same old thing. He's clearly a power nut. He's doesn't know much about the economy, doesn't know much about how people are actually motivated. He just wants to have power and recreate a glorious future for China. And I wish him well, because he's bottling up promotions of capable people in China. He's breeding dissent. His leadership of their economy is terrible. So I'm all for Xi Jinping staying as long as he possibly can, because I think that will be the best assurance that we outside of China have that they won't be the fearsome force that they could be under more dynamic leadership.
Thank you so much. So sadly, I don't think we have time for another very broad question. So just as a close-up, I would like to ask you, which president do you think has had the most successful approach to Asia in the last few decades? This is also very broad, but let's just try to make it precise, and then we can all make our own trabajo de buscar cada uno que ha hecho el presidente. So let's close with that.
So the question is, the president who's had the best policy towards Asia?
Yeah, towards Asia.
Yeah. I've never been asked that before, Pedro, and it's and I would say that almost as I'm going through the administrations in my mind, I see a combination of successes and failures through virtually every administration. I suppose part of that comes from being too familiar with the situation. You know, I have too much of on the one hand, on the other. On the other hand, I think the most successful, if you'd asked me the question about which U.S. president has had the best overall foreign policy record, I would say George H.W. Bush, George Bush Sr., his management of the end of the Cold War and reunification of Germany and the Iraq and the first Iraq War. I would say he had the most skilled team there. In Asia, he did fine, but there wasn't really the challenge from Asia in that time that we face now. In recent years, I would have to say the Biden administration is about the best that we have had. The Obama administration, in which I served, still was thinking that China could somehow be talked into being a responsible member of the world community. And like many politicians, President Obama himself thought that he was the most skillful persuader, and he would have meeting after meeting with Chinese leaders, and they would listen politely and pretend to agree with him on some things, and then there would be no follow through. President Trump, I think, it's interesting, the difference in the estimate of President Trump in Europe, where you all are, from Asia. In Asia, he was considered quite a good president, whereas, of course, most European leaders and most Europeans thought he was a dangerous and difficult person. I think that maybe was because of the timing of tweets. You know, President Trump would tend to get up early in the morning and send out these outrageous tweets. By that time, it was around noon in Europe, so your journalists and your politicians were all reading these crazy tweets over lunch, getting angry, and then you had a whole afternoon to react to them. In China, or in Asia, it was the middle of the night, and they didn't read them. And by the time they woke up in the morning, they had sort of washed through the system, so they didn't make as much of a difference. And what President Trump did do was, for the first time, take actions against China rather than simply trying to persuade them. He raised a whole round of tariffs against them. Economists argue about whether those were smart or not, but nonetheless, it was the first time that the United States actually tried to extract a penalty from Chinese behavior. I think the Biden administration has, in a way, learned from both of those experiences and is taking a combination of actions and of rhetoric and attempting communications, which is probably the right mixture. So yeah, on balance, I'd say under the stressing conditions of China's strong challenge to the international order, I would say the current administration is doing about the best.
We just have two very quick questions, more or less, and then we will finish. So let's go.
Okay, so once again, thank you for your additional 10 minutes. And my question, since you have spoken a lot about the importance, you have spoken a lot about the lack of coordination and cooperation between different agencies and the politicians as well. Taking the opportunity that most of us here present today are exactly future jurists, politicians, and businessmen, I wanted to ask you what, in your opinion, are the main aspects that we should take in account when coordinating with the secret services and armed forces in order to ensure a good and efficient government and state apparatus.
And now let's make it like the second question, like together.
Hi, thank you again, Admiral. And just a very simple question for you to answer in a simple manner, as simple as you can. How does one go from being a Navy graduate in the, let's say, lowest level to being the commander of the Pacific Forces?
Okay, I think the second question is easier to answer the first one. You work really hard at the job that you have, and you get lucky. Those are the things. The armed forces have a very hierarchical promotion system, and you're rewarded by showing how well you can do the job that you are given. But I know that there are lots of people who served with me who were just as capable, smart, and energetic as I was. And I happen to be the one who was promoted and they were not. So I tried not to fall in love with my own capability because I just knew there were so many other good people. But it primarily had to do with with working hard on the job that you were given. And in the Navy, some of the jobs that I was given were terrible jobs, and some of them were great jobs, but you try to do them all the best you can. So it's a pretty simplistic answer, but I think it has a lot of truth to it. On the question of coordinating organizations, I mean, this is a big problem, whether it's in government or in business or in universities. Everybody just wants to have their own little box that they set the standards for what is success and what is failure. And if they want something from another little box, they want support. They don't want an equal share of ideas. They don't want a shared responsibility. They just want to be provided something that will make them successful in their little box. I think that's human nature. There are some individuals who are natural cooperators, but they're a minority. The way most big organizations work is people seek to control what they have. So how do you break that down? And I watched us in the armed forces, which have fierce independent services. I watched us in the intelligence community, and I've watched us elsewhere in government. And I think there are two parts to the answer. One part has to do with the assignment of authority within an organization. And the second part has to do with the higher levels enforcing the shared responsibility that they have established. So in my case, when I was Director of National Intelligence, for example, there were a couple of issues in which I asserted my authority, in which I had I was acting in accordance with the legislation which established the office. There was no question that I was right from a legal point of view to direct the CIA to some action that the CIA did not want to take. The CIA appealed to the president over my head. And in at least one or two important cases, the president decided in favor of the CIA. And that, of course, completely undercut my ability the next time to be able to force the CIA to cooperate with the National Security Agency and with the other agencies. So you have to not only establish the authority of those who can compel cooperation and integration, but then when the hard objections come, that next echelon of authority has to back it up with a couple of tough decisions. And after that, the agencies, the organizations will understand that they must work together. The authority of the integrating authority will be upheld, and then things can happen. Now, that was what happened within the U.S. Armed Forces when the joint legislation was passed. And when I was the Pacific commander, I could tell the Pacific Navy forces what to do, the Pacific Marine forces what to do, the Pacific Air Forces what to do. And if they complained to their bosses back in Washington, because all of them had worked for me and they also worked for their boss in Washington, it was well known that my decision would be upheld. So they obeyed me. That was not true as Director of National Intelligence. It was too new an organization. The customs had not been established. So when an organization that worked for me was unhappy and appealed to the White House, the chances are that maybe my authority would be upheld, but maybe it might not be. And so the integration, the working together was not as well established. So if you're serious about bringing organizations together, then you have to set it up, and then the next level up has to enforce it. There are some mechanical things that you can do to improve it also. For example, in both the intelligence community and in the armed forces, it was required that an officer, to be promoted to a certain rank, had to work for a certain amount of time in another agency or in another service. And that did widen the understanding. When I was a Navy officer, I served for a time in a Air Force organization, and I learned, how they operate, how we could cooperate together. And so those personnel aspects of it, having to do with promotion and with assignments, can also help. But ultimately, it boils down to establishing the authorities and then enforcing them.
Okay, that was an amazing set of answers. So thank you so much, Professor Blair. I remember that on the last day of classes last year, you told me that now I would be one of the few Europeans who actually knew something about Asia. And that was a too generous a remark, of course. But I do hope that today some of that spirit has reached this room. So again, thank you so much for being here. And let's